The sun had burned the land so long that even hope felt dry. In the far reaches of the American Wild West, where dust ruled the wind and mercy was rarer than rain, Thomas McGraw stood alone beside his failing farm. His crops were dead, his well was nearly empty, and in his hands he held the last drops of water he owned, enough perhaps to keep himself alive for one more day. That was when he saw her. A small Apache girl lay collapsed near his broken fence, her lips cracked, her breath shallow, her dark eyes barely open beneath the merciless sky. She was the enemy people would have said, a danger, a mistake waiting to happen. Thomas knew the rules of the frontier. You survive by looking away. But he also knew something deeper. Once you turn your back on a dying child, you never truly come back from it. As he knelt beside her and uncorked the bottle, a question hung heavy in the desert air. How could a few simple drops of water summon a cavalry to his doorstep by the very next morning? Before we continue this story, take a moment to tell us where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We'd love to know you're here with us. And if stories of the Wild West compassion and unexpected destiny speak to your heart, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the journey ahead. The land had not always looked this way. There was a time long enough ago to feel like another lifetime when Thomas McGraw's farm carried the quiet promise of survival. The soil had once been dark and willing the corn tall enough to whisper when the wind passed through it. Back then, laughter had lived inside the small wooden house at the edge of the plain. A woman's laughter, gentle, certain, alive. Now the earth lay cracked like old skin left too long in the sun. Thomas rose slowly from the fence line after the girl disappeared down the horizon, his knees stiff, his back aching in ways that had nothing to do with age. He stood there longer than necessary, staring at the empty stretch of desert, as if the land itself might explain what had just happened. But the land never explained anything. It only took. Inside the house, the air was stale and warm. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as he crossed the room and set the empty water bottle on the table. The sound it made hollow against hollow felt louder than it should have. He did not curse. He did not sigh. He simply stared at it. That bottle had been his last defense against the heat. Thomas poured himself into the chair by the window and looked out across what remained of his fields. There were no crops left to check, no animals worth tending. The last mule had collapsed 2 weeks earlier, its ribs sharp as fence posts beneath dry hide. Thomas had buried it himself, digging through stubborn ground until his hands bled. Even then, he had not cried. Crying wasted water. He had learned that lesson early on the frontier. The neighbors, those who had not already packed up and vanished east, called him stubborn, foolish. Some said cursed. Walter Boone, the old man who lived a mile down the trail, had warned him again just last month. "Land's done with you, Tom," Walter had said, shaking his head beneath his weathered hat. "You ought to be done with it too." But Thomas McGraw had nowhere else to go. This land had taken his youth, his strength, and finally his wife. Leaving it behind would mean admitting it had won. Sarah had believed differently. He closed his eyes, and her voice came back to him as clearly as if she were standing in the doorway, hands on her hips, squinting into the sun. "This land ain't cruel," she used to say. "It just don't care. That means it's up to us to care instead." Sarah McGraw had been made of quiet courage, not the kind that shouted or demanded praise, but the kind that showed up every day, even when the world offered nothing in return. She had shared food with strangers, patched the clothes of passing travelers, and once, long before Thomas would admit it mattered, she had slipped water to a wounded Apache man hiding near their fence. Thomas remembered the fear that had seized him then, the way his chest had tightened when he realized what she'd done. "They'll kill us for this," he'd whispered. Sarah had only looked at him and said, or they'll remember it. She died the following winter, not by violence or raid, but by sickness that crept into her lungs and refused to leave. Thomas had buried her beneath the cottonwood tree where she liked to sit in the evenings, watching the sky turn red. After that, something inside him closed. He stopped talking to neighbors, stopped praying, stopped believing the world noticed the difference between kindness and weakness. Until yesterday. The Apache girl's face came back to him now, the way her lips had trembled when the water touched them, the way her small fingers had clutched the bottle as if it were the most precious thing she had ever known. She had not spoken, had not begged, only looked at him with an expression too old for a child her age. That was what had undone him. Not her hunger, not her thirst, her dignity. Thomas rose again and moved to the window, scanning the distant line of mesas. Somewhere out there, the girl was walking or being carried back to her people. Somewhere out there, words were being spoken about him. He knew how stories traveled on the frontier. They grew teeth. They learned to bite. Helping an Apache child was not a small thing. It was a dangerous thing. By midday, the heat pressed down harder, and Thomas felt the dull ache of thirst settle behind his eyes. He forced himself to move to gather what little shade he could to ration the last bits of food left in his cupboard. He worked slowly, methodically, as though routine alone could keep fear at bay. But fear had already found its way in. In the late afternoon, he heard it. At first, it was only a vibration beneath his feet, a low tremor carried through the ground. Thomas froze, heart-pounding, listening. The sound grew louder, sharper, unmistakable. Hooves, many of them. He stepped outside, shading his eyes against the sun, and stared toward the open plain. A dark shape was forming in the distance, rising with the dust. It was too organized to be wild horses, too heavy. His mouth went dry. By the time the figures came into focus, there was no doubt left. Blue coats, rifles slung across shoulders, the unmistakable discipline of U.S. cavalry riding straight toward his farm. Thomas McGraw stood alone in his yard, the sun at his back, his empty well behind him. He had given away his last drops of water, and now the consequences had arrived on horseback. As the riders slowed and spread out surrounding the small farm, with practiced ease, Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him. He straightened his shoulders, wiped the dust from his hands, and waited. Because whatever came next, arrest, accusation, or worse, he knew one thing for certain. He would not regret the choice he had made, but he had no idea whether the frontier would forgive him for it. The Apache girl did not remember when the walking had begun, only that the sun had been high when her feet first touched the open plain, and higher still when the strength began to drain from her legs. Each step afterward became a decision, each breath a bargain. She had been told not to stop. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, low, steady, never raised even in danger. Keep moving. If you fall, rise again. If you cannot rise, crawl. The land does not wait. Loila had obeyed. She always did. The path she followed was not marked by road or trail, only by instinct and the faint promise of shade far ahead. Her small feet kicked dust into the air, and the wind carried it back into her face as if the land itself were pushing her away. The water skin she carried had been empty since morning. She had shaken it once, twice, listening for any sound that might mean hope. There had been none. By midday, the heat wrapped around her like a living thing. Her mouth burned. Her tongue felt too large for her lips. She stopped counting steps because numbers no longer mattered. Time slowed, stretched thin by thirst. When she finally saw the fence leaning crooked against the horizon, she thought at first it was another trick of the light. But fences did not move. She stumbled toward it, vision narrowing the sky, blurring at the edges. Her knees buckled before she reached the gate, and she fell hard against the earth. The ground felt hot, even through her clothing. She pressed her forehead to it, breathing shallow, conserving what little air she could draw. She did not cry out. Apache children were taught early noise invited danger, so she waited. Boots appeared in her vision, dusty worn, unmoving. She lifted her eyes slowly, forcing them open despite the sting. The man standing over her looked nothing like the soldiers she had been warned about. His clothes were plain. His shoulders sloped with exhaustion. His eyes, when they met hers, did not carry anger. They carried fear. Fear, she realized, not of her, but for her. When he knelt, the shadow he cast felt like relief itself. She watched his hands tremble as he opened the bottle, watched the hesitation that came before the water touched her lips. When it did, she almost pulled away, afraid it might disappear if she drank too fast. She forced herself to sip, slowly, carefully. The water slid down her throat like life returning each swallow a small miracle. She closed her eyes, gripping the bottle with fingers that barely worked anymore. Somewhere distant, the man spoke, but she did not hear the words. She only felt the kindness in the way he waited, the way he did not rush her, the way he looked as though this act cost him something real. When the bottle was empty, she lowered it gently and looked up at him again. She wanted to say thank you, but the words stayed trapped inside her chest. Instead, she pressed her palm against her heart and bowed her head, a gesture older than language. The man seemed to understand. He nodded once as if accepting a promise. She stayed the night in his house, curled near the wall, half awake, even in sleep. Years of danger had taught her never to rest fully. Every sound pulled her back to alertness. The creak of wood, the sigh of wind, the man's slow breathing from the other side of the room. He never came close. At dawn, she rose quietly. The man still slept, lines of fatigue carved deep into his face. For a moment she hesitated. Leaving without a word felt wrong, but staying would bring danger down on him faster than leaving ever could. She stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing her skin like forgiveness. Before she turned away, she looked back once more at the small farm, the dry land, the broken fence, the house that had offered her water when none was owed. She memorized it. Then she walked. It took her most of the day to reach the place where the land rose into stone and the wind smelled different. She was no longer alone there. Figures emerged from behind rocks, from shadows she had known all her life. Hands steadied her when she nearly fell. Voices murmured her name. Her father was waiting. Chief Nantan stood tall despite the years his hair bound back his face, carved by sun and responsibility. When he saw her stumble toward him, his stillness shattered. He crossed the ground in 3 long strides and gathered her into his arms, holding her as though the world might try to steal her away again. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and smoke. Only then did the shaking begin. He did not scold her, did not ask why she had gone so far alone. He waited until her breathing slowed, until the strength returned to her limbs. Only then did he pull back and look into her eyes. "Water," she whispered. The word scraped her throat raw. She was given water, then food, then time. As the sun dipped lower, she told her story in fragments of the empty skin, the endless heat, the farm that appeared where death had waited the man who had given her everything he had left. Nantan listened without interruption. When she finished, silence settled over the group. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere a bird cried out and fell quiet again. "A poor farmer," one of the warriors said slowly. "A foolish one." Nantan's gaze remained on his daughter. "A brave one," he corrected. He rose and turned toward the west, where the land flattened and stretched toward the horizon. He knew the way of soldiers, knew how quickly kindness could be mistaken for treachery. "They will come," he said quietly. "For him." Layla felt fear twist in her chest. She stepped forward, gripping his arm. "He saved me." Nantan placed his hand over hers. "Then we will not forget him." As the Apache prepared to move, dust rose again in the distance, this time not from their own steps, but from another direction entirely. A line of riders cut across the plain, their formation sharp, deliberate. Blue coats caught the light. Lila's heart sank. She turned back toward the land where the farm lay hidden beyond sight, knowing without needing to be told that the man who had given her water now stood alone, facing forces far larger than himself, and the frontier was already deciding what his kindness would cost. The cavalry did not speak when they arrived. They rode in with the economy of men who had done this many times before, spreading wide ceiling exits that barely existed, stopping just far enough away to remind a lone farmer how small he truly was. Horses snorted and stamped. Leather creaked. Metal clicked softly. The sound of discipline settled over Thomas McGraw's land like a second heat. Thomas stood where he was, hands empty and visible, his hat resting against his thigh. He had been raised to believe that if a man was honest, the truth would find its way through. The frontier had tested that belief again and again, but it had not broken it. Yet. Captain Jonathan Hale dismounted last. He was younger than Thomas expected, mid-30s perhaps, but his face carried the weight of command. His eyes moved constantly, not in fear, but in calculation, measuring the fence, the well, the dry fields, the man standing alone before him. "You, Thomas McGraw," Hale asked. "I am." "Name's Captain Jonathan Hale, United States Cavalry." He gestured once, and 2 soldiers shifted closer. "We're here about an Apache child." Thomas felt the words settle in his chest like stones. He did not flinch. "She came through yesterday," he said, "near dead from thirst." Hale studied him carefully. "And you helped her?" "Yes." A pause followed. The wind passed between them, lifting dust that settled on boots and coats alike. Hale's gaze dropped briefly to the empty well behind the house, then to the cracked earth. "You understand," Hale said slowly, "that aiding hostile tribes can be construed as treason." Thomas met his eyes. She was a child. Another pause, this one longer. Hale turned away, scanning the horizon. Where is she now? Gone before sunrise. That at least was true in every way that mattered. Hale nodded once, as though he had expected the answer. He motioned to a soldier who dismounted and approached the house. The man peered inside, then returned, shaking his head. "No supplies," the soldier said. "Barely anything left." Hale frowned. "You give her water." Thomas did not hesitate. "All I had." That earned him a look sharp, searching, almost disbelieving. Hale's jaw tightened, then relaxed. "You understand what you've done. I understand what I chose." Thomas replied, For a moment, something flickered behind Hale's eyes, recognition perhaps, or the ghost of a choice he had once faced himself, but it passed, quickly replaced by duty. "We've had reports," Hale said. "Apache movement east of the mesas. Scouts say a child went missing from Chief Nanton's camp yesterday morning." Thomas felt the name strike him like a bell. The girl had not said it aloud, but he had known somehow that her people would come looking. And when they do, Hale continued, they tend to respond with force. Thomas glanced at the horizon where the heat shimmered. "They'll come for her," he said quietly. "Not for me." Hale's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "That's where you may be mistaken." The captain stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You may have meant mercy, but mercy looks a lot like alliance when viewed from the wrong angle." Thomas did not answer. He thought of the bottle in his hands, of Sarah's voice, of the way the girl had bowed her head, promising something without words. "If they come," Thomas said at last, "they won't come to fight." Hale straightened. "And you're certain of that?" "No," Thomas admitted. "I'm certain of why they'll come." Before Hale could respond, a shout rose from the edge of the formation. One of the scouts pointed toward the west. Movement. Dust low and spreading rolled across the plain like a living thing. Shapes formed within it, dark figures on horseback, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the sky. They did not charge. They advanced at a measured pace, slow enough to be deliberate. Apache. The cavalry stiffened hands, going instinctively to reins and rifles. Orders rippled through the ranks in murmurs and signals. Hale lifted a hand, stopping them. Thomas felt his heart begin to pound, not with fear, but with the weight of consequence. The land seemed to hold its breath. As the riders drew closer, he could make out faces, stern, unreadable, bound by purpose rather than rage. At their center rode a man taller than the rest, his presence commanding without effort. Thomas knew without being told that this was Chief Nanton. The Apache stopped just beyond rifle range. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Nanton raised one hand. Hale returned the gesture, careful and restrained. He stepped forward alone, stopping several paces ahead of his men. Thomas remained where he was, neither side claiming him, neither side releasing him. Nanton's voice carried across the space between them, deep, steady, and calm. He spoke in English, accented but clear. "I seek the man who gave my daughter water." All eyes turned to Thomas. The heat pressed harder now, sweat trickling down his spine. He took a breath and stepped forward. "I am that man," he said. Nanton studied him as one might study a mountain, patiently without hurry. His gaze moved from Thomas's face to his hands, to his worn clothes, to the empty well behind him. "You gave what you did not have," Nanton said. Thomas nodded. "I did what I could." Nanton inclined his head once. "That is enough." Hale shifted uneasy. "Chief Nanton, he said your people's movements have alarmed this territory. We're here to ensure peace." Nanton did not look at him. "Peace does not come from fear," he replied. "It comes from memory." He turned back to Thomas. "My daughter lives because of you." Thomas felt a strange tightness in his chest. "I'm glad." Nanton raised his hand again, and Lila stepped forward from among the Apache. She looked stronger now, steadier on her feet. When she saw Thomas, her eyes lit with recognition. She pressed her palm to her heart. The gesture rippled through the Apache ranks. One by one, warriors followed suit. Hale stared, caught between relief and disbelief. But the moment did not resolve itself into peace. Not yet, because orders once given did not vanish simply because kindness had intervened. And Thomas mcgraw stood at the center of forces larger than himself, forces that would demand a reckoning before the sun fell. The last drops of water had been given. Now the cost would be counted. The standoff did not break with a shout or a shot. It broke with silence. Chief Nanton lowered his hand, and the Apache riders remained still, their horses calm, as if they too understood the weight of the moment. Captain Jonathan Hale glanced back at his men, then forward again, measuring the space between command and catastrophe. Captain Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying farther than he expected, "If there's blame to be placed, it's mine alone." Hale turned sharply. "You don't speak for them. I speak for myself," Thomas replied. "No one told me to help that child. No one forced my hand." Nanton watched this exchange with interest, his expression unreadable. "This man speaks truth," he said. "He acted without promise of reward." Hale hesitated. The cavalry's doctrine had never prepared him for this. A poor farmer offering himself as shield, an Apache chief speaking of honor in measured tones. The frontier preferred simpler stories, enemies, allies, clear lines drawn in dust. Night, however, had a way of softening lines. The sun dipped lower and the heat loosened its grip. Shadows lengthened across the ground, turning the farmyard into a landscape of gray and gold. Hale exhaled slowly, then made a decision that surprised even him. "We'll camp," he said, gesturing toward the open plain. "No movement tonight." Murmurs rippled through the ranks, but no one questioned him. The Apache remained where they were, neither advancing nor retreating. As the last light faded, a fragile balance settled, intense, uncertain, but intact. Thomas retreated to his porch, sitting heavily on the step. The day's strain pressed down on him now, leaving his limbs weak. Lila approached slowly, her steps careful, as if she feared breaking something unseen. She stopped a few paces away and knelt, lowering herself until her eyes were level with his. From a small pouch at her side, she produced a folded piece of dried fruit and extended it toward him. "For you," she said softly. Thomas stared at it, stunned. "You need that more than I do." She shook her head. "My father says debts must be returned." He took the offering with trembling fingers. "Thank you," he said, meaning far more than the word could hold. As darkness settled, fully fires were lit at a distance, one cluster for the cavalry, another for the Apache. The night filled with quiet sounds, the crackle of flame, the low murmur of voices, the distant call of a night bird. For the first time in days, Thomas did not feel alone beneath the vast sky. He lay awake on his narrow bed, the house open to the cooling air. Sleep came in fragments, broken by memory. He dreamed of Sarah, of her hands guiding his as they planted seeds that never came to harvest. He dreamed of water flowing freely, of laughter carried on wind that did not burn. When morning came, it arrived without hostility. Thomas stepped outside to find Captain Hale waiting near the fence, his coat unbuttoned, his posture less rigid than before. The captain studied the horizon, then turned. "I spoke with my superiors last night," Hale said. "There will be no arrest today." Thomas released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But Hale continued, "This land remains under watch. Any further incidents, real or perceived, and the response may not be so measured." "I understand," Thomas said. Hale nodded, then hesitated. "You could have stayed quiet," he added. "Could have let this pass you by." Thomas met his gaze. "Some things don't pass you by," he said. "They stop in front of your fence." Hale gave a short, humorless laugh. "That they do." The Apache began to prepare for departure as the sun climbed. Lila lingered near Thomas, her presence a quiet comfort. Chief Nantan approached last, his steps unhurried. "You have little," Nantan said, looking at the barren fields. "Yet you gave much." Thomas shrugged. "Didn't feel like much at the time." Nantan reached into his satchel and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in leather. He placed it in Thomas's hands. Inside were seeds, dark, hard, promising. "These grow where others fail," Nantan said. "Plant them when the rains come." Thomas closed his fingers around the bundle. "I don't know how to repay you." "You already have," Nantan replied. The Apache mounted and turned west, their figures soon swallowed by distance. The cavalry followed shortly after dusk, rising once more, but this time it did not feel like a threat. Thomas stood alone again, the farm quiet in their wake. Yet the silence was different now. It held possibility. He walked to the well and lowered the bucket out of habit, knowing it would scrape against stone. When he pulled it up, the bucket was empty as expected. Still, he smiled faintly. Because for the first time in a long while, emptiness did not feel like an ending. As he returned to the house, Thomas McGraw understood that the frontier had not changed overnight. The land was still harsh, the future uncertain. But somewhere between the last drops of water and the night without shadows, something had shifted. And whatever storms lay ahead, he would face them standing. Morning came softly, almost shyly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. A pale ribbon of light slipped over the horizon and stretched across the cracked earth, turning dust into gold and shadows into memory. Thomas McGraw stood outside his house long before the sun fully rose, breathing in air that still held a trace of night's coolness. His bones ached, his mouth felt dry, but his mind was awake in a way it had not been for years. The land looked the same, barren, exhausted, unforgiving, yet Thomas did not. He moved slowly across the yard, checking the fence out of habit rather than necessity. The broken rails leaned just as they had before. The well remained empty. The wind whispered over fields that had long forgotten the weight of grain. Nothing had changed, and everything had. From the edge of the plain, Walter Boone appeared walking with the careful steps of an old man who no longer trusted the ground beneath him. He stopped short when he saw Thomas standing there, alive, unchained, unharmed. "Well, I'll be damned," Walter muttered. "Heard the cavalry rode in yesterday." Thought for sure you'd be gone by morning." "So did I," Thomas replied. Walter approached, squinting at the empty yard as though expecting soldiers to spring from the dust. What happened? Thomas considered the question. How did one explain mercy without sounding foolish? How did one describe a night balanced on the edge of violence that never came? "I gave a child water," he said simply. "Turns out that matters to some folks." Walter shook his head slowly. "World's upside down," maybe Thomas said. "Or maybe we just forgot how it's supposed to be." Walter did not argue. He studied Thomas for a long moment, then nodded once. "If you need help fixing that fence, I reckon I could spare a few boards." Thomas smiled, a small, genuine thing that surprised them both. As the day wore on, Thomas set about the quiet work of survival. He mended what he could, rested when the heat demanded it, and drank sparingly from a small jar he had hidden away for emergencies. The seeds Chief Nantan had given him lay wrapped in leather on the table untouched. He did not yet trust himself to hope. By midday, the dust returned. This time, it came from a single rider. Thomas stepped outside, shading his eyes, heart tightening despite himself. The horse slowed as it approached its rider, lifting a hand in greeting. "Blue coat, Cavalry." Captain Jonathan Hale dismounted alone. "I thought you'd be gone by now," Thomas said. "So did my men," Hale replied, but command wanted confirmation. No further Apache movement east. No retaliation. "That's good," Thomas said. "For everyone." Hale nodded. "I wanted to speak with you before we move out." Thomas gestured toward the porch. "Shade's better than standing." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind. Hale removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I've been in this territory a long time," he said. "Long enough to see how these things usually end." "And how do they usually end?" Thomas asked. "With graves," Hale answered. "On both sides." Thomas considered that. Maybe that's why this one didn't. Hale looked at him sharply. "You don't think this was luck?" "No," Thomas said. "I think it was choice." Hale exhaled long and slow. "I don't know if the Army will see it that way." "The Army doesn't have to live here," Thomas replied. That struck something. Hale leaned back, staring out at the plain. "You could leave," he said suddenly. "This land's given you nothing but grief. You've earned the right to walk away." Thomas shook his head. "This land took my wife," he said quietly. "If I leave, it takes her memory too." Hale studied him, then stood. "If more men thought like you," he said, "this frontier might look different." Maybe Thomas said. Or maybe it'd just look honest. Hale mounted his horse and turned east. "Take care of yourself, mcgraw." "You too, Captain." When the rider disappeared into the distance, Thomas felt the familiar pull of solitude return. But it no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like space room enough to decide what came next. That evening, clouds gathered low on the horizon. They were thin and uncertain, but they were there. Thomas stood watching them long after the sun dipped away the leather bundle of seeds warm in his pocket. Sarah's voice came back to him then, gentle and clear. Plant them anyway. He did not know if rain would come. He did not know if the seeds would take root in soil that had forgotten how to give. But he knew this: the frontier had watched him choose compassion over fear, and for once it had not punished him for it. As darkness settled, Thomas mcgraw walked out into his field, knelt, and pressed his fingers into the dry earth. He planted the first seed, carefully covering it with soil as tenderly as if it were alive already. Above him, thunder rolled faintly distant and undecided. Thomas looked up at the sky and waited, because the morning after mercy was not an ending. It was a beginning the frontier had not expected. The thunder did not bring rain that night. It lingered far away, a low promise that never crossed the plain. Thomas mcgraw lay awake, listening to it fade, the air thick with the smell of dust and possibility. When dawn came, it arrived sharp and bright, the sky scrubbed clean of clouds as if the land itself had decided not to be persuaded so easily. Thomas rose before the heat washed his face with a careful splash from his jar and stepped outside. The field where he had planted the first seed looked unchanged, dry, cracked, indifferent. Still, he stood there a long while, letting the sun warm his shoulders, reminding himself that beginnings rarely announce themselves with fanfare. By mid-morning, the wind shifted. It came from the south, this time, steady and purposeful, carrying with it a faint vibration that set the fence rails humming. Thomas paused in the middle of hammering a loose board and listened. The sound was distant but unmistakable. Hooves. Not the scattered rhythm of a lone rider, not the wandering thunder of wild horses. Many. Thomas shaded his eyes and scanned the horizon. At first he saw nothing but heat shimmer and dust devils dancing across the plain. Then, gradually, the dust thickened, flattening into a low advancing line. His chest tightened. He had thought the reckoning had passed. He had believed, perhaps foolishly, that mercy, once given and acknowledged, would settle the land. But the frontier had a way of circling back, of testing resolve again and again, until it knew what a man was made of. As the shapes grew clearer, Thomas counted instinctively. 10, 20, more than he could track with certainty. The riders moved with the ease of men who knew the ground beneath them and trusted one another to hold formation without command. Apache. Thomas did not run. He set the hammer down carefully and stood where he was, hands open at his sides. He did not know if this was the same group that had come with Chief Nantan the day before. He did not know if news had traveled faster than peace. He only knew that fear, once invited in, was difficult to send away. The riders slowed well before reaching the fence. They spread out not in aggression, but in awareness, giving one another room. When they stopped, a familiar figure rode forward. Chief Nantan dismounted and approached alone. Thomas stepped toward him, meeting him halfway. The two men stood facing each other. The distance between them measured not in yards, but in history. "There is trouble," Nantan said. Thomas nodded. "I felt it coming." "Not from us," Nantan continued. "From the north. Settlers. They speak of retaliation, of showing strength." "For what?" Thomas asked. "For kindness," Nantan replied. The words struck harder than Thomas expected. He glanced toward the empty plain, imagining fear taking shape in men who had not been there, who had not seen the girl drink, who had not heard the silence break without bloodshed. "They think mercy makes them weak," Thomas said. Nantan studied him. "Do you, Thomas, thought of the seed beneath the soil?" "No," he said. "I think it makes us accountable." Nantan inclined his head slightly. "Then we must act carefully." Behind the chief, the Apache riders waited calm but alert. Among them, Thomas saw Lila sitting tall in her saddle, watching him with solemn eyes. She lifted her hand briefly in greeting, then lowered it again. "What do you need from me?" Thomas asked. Nantan did not answer immediately. He looked past Thomas to the farm, the broken fence, the dry well, the field holding a fragile hope beneath its surface. "We will move west by sunset," he said at last. "But if settlers come before then, they may not listen to reason." "And you want me to leave," Thomas said. "No," Nantan said. "I want you to stay." Thomas blinked. "Stay?" "You are known to them," Nantan explained. "They will listen to you when they will not listen to us. Your voice carries weight here." Thomas felt the burden settle on him. He had never sought to be anything more than a man tending his land. Now that land had made him a bridge between forces that did not trust one another. "I don't have authority," he said. Nantan's gaze was steady. "You have witness." The riders turned their horses and moved off toward the west, leaving Thomas alone again, dust drifting slowly back to earth. He watched until they were gone, then turned toward the north, where the plain stretched wide and empty. For hours, nothing happened. The sun climbed. The heat returned. Thomas worked when he could, rested when he had to, and listened. Late in the afternoon, he heard voices before he saw them. Sharp, hurried, carried on the wind. 3 wagons crested a low rise, followed by men on horseback. They approached with less discipline than the cavalry, but more urgency. Rifles were visible, faces tight with suspicion. They stopped within shouting distance. One man dismounted and stepped forward. He was broad-shouldered, red-faced, his hat pulled low. "You McGraw," he called. "I am Thomas," replied. "Name's Caleb Morris," the man said. "We heard you've been feeding Apache." Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "I gave water to a child." Murmurs rippled through the group. "That's how it starts," Morris said. "Next thing you know, they're cutting throats in the night." Thomas shook his head. "You weren't there." "Don't need to be," Morris snapped. "We're here to make sure this don't happen again." Thomas took a step forward. "You want to stop bloodshed? Then you stop right here." Morris laughed, harsh and humorless. "You think standing in front of us makes you brave?" Thomas met his gaze. "No," he said. "It makes me responsible." Silence fell heavy and uncertain. From the west, a faint dust line appeared. Apache riders returning sooner than planned. Morris's eyes flicked toward it, then back to Thomas. "You brought them here," he said. "No," Thomas replied. "You did." The moment stretched thin, taut as wire. And in that space between fear and understanding, between dust and decision, the frontier leaned in, waiting to see which way the balance would fall. Thomas McGraw felt the eyes of every man settle on him, heavy as stones. The settlers stood with their rifles loose in their hands, not yet raised, but not resting either. Behind them, wagons creaked as horses shifted their weight, sensing the tension they could not understand. The air smelled of sweat dust and fear. Fear sharpened into something that wanted permission. Caleb Morris took another step forward. "Last chance, mcgraw," he said. "Step aside." Thomas did not move. He thought of the girl's cracked lips, of the way water had changed everything without asking for anything in return. He thought of Sarah's hands, steady and sure, guiding seeds into ground that did not promise kindness. And he thought of the riders approaching from the west, measured, disciplined, not yet hostile, but ready. "I won't," Thomas said. His voice surprised him. It did not shake. Morris sneered. "You choose them over your own. I'm choosing what keeps us alive," Thomas replied. "All of us." A murmur rose. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably. Others bristled anger, flickering at the suggestion that restraint could be strength. The frontier had taught them a simpler language, one that spoke in threats and answers, in shots fired and buried consequences. From the west, the Apache riders drew closer, stopping well short of the settlers. Chief Nanton dismounted again, his posture open, his hands visible. He did not speak. He waited. Thomas took a breath and turned slightly, placing himself squarely between the two groups. He could feel the sun on his back, the land beneath his boots. He raised his hands not in surrender, but in invitation. "Listen to me," he said. "All of you." Caleb Morris scoffed. "Why should we?" "Because I'm the one who stood here yesterday when the cavalry came," Thomas answered. "Because I'm the one who gave water when there was none to spare. And because if this turns bloody, it'll be on all of us." One of the settlers, a younger man with dust-streaked cheeks, spoke up. "He's right, Caleb. We didn't see what happened." Morris rounded on him. "And you take an Apache's word for it," Thomas cut in. "Take mine." Silence fell again. The wind passed through, stirring the dust into low spirals that rose and fell like breath. Thomas felt the weight of his own words press inward. He had never asked men to trust him before. He had never needed to. "Chief Nanton's daughter lives because I gave her water," Thomas continued. "And because she lived, no one died yesterday. Not a settler, not an Apache, not a soldier." Morris's jaw clenched. "And tomorrow depends on what we do now," Thomas said. "If you ride forward with rifles raised, they'll answer. If you hold, so will they." Morris looked past Thomas to the Apache, gauging distance, numbers, angles. He was not a fool. He was afraid, and fear made men gamble. Nanton spoke then, his voice calm and even, carried easily across the space. "We did not come to take," he said. "We came to remember." Morris bristled. "Remember what? That kindness can cross borders," Nanton replied. "That water given in need does not belong to one people alone." The younger settler shifted again. "Caleb, maybe we hear them out." Morris hesitated. He was a leader because he filled the space when others doubted. Now doubt crowded him, pressing from all sides. Thomas saw the opening and stepped into it. "You want strength," he said. "Show it by standing down." Morris's eyes searched Thomas's face, looking for weakness, for a crack he could exploit. He found none, only resolve, born not of bravado, but of acceptance. At last, Morris exhaled sharply. He lifted his hand and signaled his men to lower their rifles. The sound of metal easing back felt louder than gunfire. Nanton inclined his head once. The Apache riders relaxed, tension loosening, but not vanishing. Lila watched Thomas closely, her expression solemn, as if she understood the cost of the moment better than anyone. The balance held, for now. Morris turned to Thomas, his voice quieter. "You're asking us to trust that this ends here. I'm asking you to trust that it doesn't have to start," Thomas replied. A long moment passed. Then Morris nodded, once curt and reluctant. "We'll head north," he said. "But if anything happens, I'll answer for it," Thomas said. Morris mounted his horse. The settlers followed, wagons creaking back into motion. Dust rose again, but this time it drifted away, not toward. When they were gone, Thomas felt his knees weaken. He leaned briefly against the fence, steadying himself. Nanton approached, stopping a respectful distance away. "You spoke with courage," the chief said. Thomas shook his head. "I spoke because I had to." Nanton considered that. "That is courage." The Apache mounted and turned west once more, Lila lingering a heartbeat longer. She pressed her palm to her heart again, then followed her people into the gathering dusk. Thomas stood alone as the light faded, the land quiet once more. The seed beneath the soil waited. The sky darkened. Somewhere thunder murmured again, closer this time, but still undecided. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He only knew that his voice had held the line today, and that the frontier, unsettled and watching, would remember. Because once a man learns the weight of his voice, he can never pretend it is light again. Night fell hard after the settlers left, as if the land itself needed darkness to recover from what had almost been done. Thomas McGraw stayed outside long after the last wagon disappeared, listening to the quiet settle back into its old places. Crickets resumed their song. The wind cooled. The stars emerged sharp and unblinking witnesses to choices that could not be taken back. He slept little. When dawn came, it brought riders again, this time with the unmistakable cadence of discipline. Blue coats crested the rise to the east sunlight, catching on metal and leather. Captain Jonathan Hale rode at their head, posture rigid, jaw set. Thomas knew that look. It meant orders had arrived. Hale dismounted and approached, boots crunching softly in the dirt. "McGraw," he said, "we need to talk." Thomas nodded, figured as much. Hale unfolded a paper, smoothing it against his thigh. Commands concerned about the volatility in this area. Reports of settler movement. Apache riders a near confrontation. They want control restored. "And what does control look like today?" Thomas asked. Hale hesitated. "A show of force. A sweep west to push the Apache back beyond the mesas." Thomas felt the words like a hand closing around his chest. They were already moving west. "They don't know that," Hale said. "And even if they did, orders stand." The cavalry began to spread out, checking ground, conferring quietly. Thomas glanced toward the west, where the land rose into stone and shadow. He thought of Lila's steady eyes, of Chief Nanton's measured restraint. A sweep would not look like peace to them. It would look like betrayal. "You do this," Thomas said, "and yesterday means nothing." Hale's gaze hardened. Yesterday bought time, nothing more. Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Captain, you saw it. You heard them. No one wants blood." Hale looked away. Wanting and avoiding aren't the same. The words hung between them. Hale folded the paper and tucked it away. "We ride in an hour," he said. "I suggest you stay clear." Thomas did not answer. He walked back to his porch, sat, and stared at the seeds on his table. He weighed them in his palm, then slipped them back into the leather. Say. If the cavalry rode west, those seeds would never see rain. By mid-morning, dust rose again, this time from two directions. Apache riders appeared on the far edge of the plain, moving with purpose, but not haste. They stopped short, their line quiet and composed. Chief Nanton rode forward alone, stopping well outside rifle range. He waited. Hale mounted. "They're forming," he said to his lieutenant. "Prepare." Thomas stepped into the open. "Captain," he called, "if you ride now, you turn a promise into a lie." Hale's eyes flicked to him. "Step aside, McGraw." Thomas did not. He turned instead toward Chief Nanton and raised his hands not as a signal of surrender, but as a plea for patience. Nanton inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the gesture. Thomas faced the cavalry again. "You want control," he said, voice carrying. "You won't get it with dust and threats. You'll get it by keeping your word." Hale rode closer, stopping within a few paces. "You're interfering with military operations." "I'm protecting lives," Thomas replied. "Yours included." A ripple of unease passed through the ranks. Some soldiers looked at Thomas with irritation, others with something like respect. Hale saw it. He felt command slipping into uncertainty. From the west, Nanton spoke, his voice calm. "We are leaving," he said, "by sunset. We ask only that you do not follow." Hale hesitated. The order burned in his pocket. The men waited for him to decide who he was going to be today. Captain Thomas said quietly, "Call it reconnaissance. Call it restraint. But don't call it peace if you break it." Hale closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Then he lifted his hand. "Hold," he ordered. Relief moved through the line like wind through grass. The rifles stayed lowered. The horses stilled. Hale turned to Nanton. "We will not pursue today," he said. "But if there's trouble, there will not be." Nanton replied, "Not from us." The Apache riders turned as one and began to move west, dust rising gently behind them. Lila looked back once, catching Thomas's eye. She nodded, small and solemn. Hale dismounted again, the tension draining from his shoulders. He approached Thomas and spoke low. "This buys you nothing permanent." Thomas met his gaze. "It buys time. Sometimes that's everything." Hale studied him for a long moment. "You're a dangerous man, McGraw." Thomas smiled faintly. "Only to bad ideas." By afternoon, the plain was empty again. The cavalry packed up and rode east. Silence returned, thicker now, layered with what might have been. Thomas walked out to his field and knelt, pressing another seed into the earth. He covered it gently, then another and another, until his fingers were caked with dust in hope. The sky darkened late in the day. Clouds gathered, real ones this time, heavy and low. The first drops fell slowly, spaced wide, testing the ground. Thomas stood in the rain and let it soak him through, because orders written in dust could be erased, and sometimes mercy lasted long enough to matter. The rain did not fall hard at first. It tested the land with patience, as if asking permission to stay. Thomas McGraw stood in it until his shirt clung to his back and the dust turned to dark paste beneath his boots. He did not move. He had learned that some moments asked only to be witnessed. When the rain strengthened, he went inside and sat at the table listening to water drum against the roof. Each sound felt like a promise spoken aloud. He thought of the seeds resting beneath the soil, small, dark, stubborn, and allowed himself for the first time to imagine a season beyond survival. By late afternoon, the rain eased. The sky remained heavy low clouds dragging their bellies across the horizon. Thomas stepped outside again and saw fresh tracks cutting across the wet ground, horse tracks new and purposeful. Apache. They approached without haste, a small group this time. Chief Nantan rode at their head, his posture straight, his eyes steady. When he dismounted, Thomas noticed something different in his bearing. Not urgency, not caution, but resolve. "You stayed," Nantan said. "So did you," Thomas replied. Nantan inclined his head. "I stayed to give a name to what happened." Thomas waited. Nantan reached into his satchel and withdrew a narrow strip of carved wood. Symbols marked its surface lines and shapes that spoke a language older than fences. He held it out. "This bears my family's mark," Nantan said. "It says that the life you saved is bound to mine." Thomas took it carefully. The wood was warm, smooth with age. "I didn't save her to be remembered," he said. "I know," Nantan replied. "That is why you must be." They stood in silence while the wind lifted the smell of wet earth around them. Lila stepped forward, then carrying a small skin of water. She held it out to Thomas with both hands. "For the well," she said. Thomas accepted it. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "My father says your name will be spoken." Thomas felt a tightening in his chest. "My name's not important." Nantan met his gaze. "Names are how we keep truth from being lost." The Apache did not linger. They mounted and turned west once more, disappearing into the hills as the light began to fade. Thomas stood alone again, the carved strip heavy in his pocket. That night he slept deeply. The next days brought a change Thomas had not dared to expect. Rain returned soft at first, then steady. The ground drank it in greedily. Cracks closed. The field darkened. When Thomas knelt to check the soil, he found it cool and alive beneath his fingers. Neighbors came drawn by rumor and curiosity. Walter Boone arrived first, leaning on his cane, eyes wide as he took in the sight of green, pushing through brown. "Looks like you've been busy," Walter said. "Looks like the land finally decided to listen," Thomas replied. Others followed men who had once passed by without a word, women who brought bread and questions in equal measure. They asked about the cavalry, about the Apache, about the rain. Thomas told them what mattered and left the rest unsaid. A week later, Captain Hale returned. He arrived alone, dismounted, and removed his hat as he approached the porch. "Command's been reassigned," he said. "This sector's quiet now." Thomas nodded. "That's good." Hale hesitated. "They asked about you." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Did they?" They wanted to know how a poor farmer managed to keep a line from breaking. Thomas considered the question. "I didn't keep it," he said. "I stood in it." Hale smiled faintly. "You ever think about coming east? There's work for men who can think." Thomas shook his head. "My work's here." Hale extended his hand. "Then I hope this land treats you better." After he left, Thomas returned to his field and worked until dusk. The seedlings were fragile pale against the dark earth, but they were there proof that beginnings did not need permission. That evening, as the sky burned orange and violet, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Thomas recognized the approach, unhurried, deliberate. Chief Nantan dismounted and came forward. "The settlers speak your name," Nantan said. "The soldiers speak it too." Thomas sighed. "I'd hoped that would fade." "It will," Nantan replied, "if you let it." He gestured toward the field. "The rains came because the land remembered. People will too, some with fear, some with gratitude." Thomas looked at the seedlings. "I can live with that." Nantan studied him. "My daughter asked what your name means." Thomas smiled. "mcgraw," he said. "It doesn't mean much." Nantan considered this. "It means the man who did not look away," he said. Thomas felt the weight of the words settle gently like rain after dust. They stood together as night came, two men from different worlds bound by a single choice. When Nantan mounted to leave, he paused. "If trouble comes again," he said, "send word." Thomas nodded. "And if peace comes," Nantan smiled a rare small curve of the mouth. "Then plant more seeds." When he was gone, Thomas sat on his porch and watched the stars emerge. He thought of Sarah, of water shared, of lines held, and names spoken. He understood then that what he had done could not be undone and did not need to be, because a father's name had been given, and with it a future had begun to take shape, fragile as green shoots in a field that had once known only dust. The land changed its voice as summer deepened. Where dust had once whispered, now there was the hush of leaves. The seedlings grew into slender stalks, pale green against the darkened soil, bending easily when the wind passed, but never breaking. Thomas McGraw worked among them each morning, careful with his steps, mindful of the miracle unfolding inch by inch beneath his boots. He did not hurry the work. He had learned that the land, like people, responded better to patience than force. Word traveled faster than rain. By the time the stalks reached his knees, travelers were already stopping by the farm, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, a few with gratitude they did not know how to voice. They spoke of an uneasy quiet to the west of Apache camps, moving farther into the hills, of soldiers riding different routes, keeping their distance. And always threaded through their talk was the same question: why did they let you live? Thomas answered the same way every time: because I didn't ask to be spared. Most did not understand that. A few pretended to. One afternoon, as the sun settled into its long descent, Thomas heard hooves again, slow, measured, familiar. Chief Nantan arrived with a small group dismounting near the fence where the wood had finally been replaced. He carried no weapon in his hands, only a cloth-wrapped bundle. "There is a matter we must speak of," Nantan said. Thomas nodded. "Come inside. It's cooler." They sat at the table where Sarah's hands had once rested, where seeds had been weighed and watered. Nantan unwrapped the bundle to reveal a set of carved bone tokens, each marked with a symbol. He placed them carefully between them. "These are records," he said, "of debts." Thomas frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "In our law," Nantan continued, "a life saved creates an obligation, not a burden, a bond. It is not paid with goods alone. It is paid with action when needed." Thomas leaned back, considering. "And you're telling me this now because others will come." Nantan said, "Not all will listen as we did." The truth of that settled in Thomas's chest. He had felt it too, the way calm invited testing, the way restraint was mistaken for weakness by those who only understood force. "I'm not a warrior," Thomas said. "I don't have men or weapons." Nantan's gaze was steady. "You have a place that speaks." Before Thomas could ask what that meant, a commotion rose outside. Voices hurried and sharp. Thomas stood and stepped onto the porch. A wagon had pulled in hard, its wheels throwing mud. A woman climbed down her dress, torn at the hem, fear bright in her eyes. 2 children followed, clinging to her skirts. Behind them stood Walter Boone, breathless. "They came through the North Trail," Walter said. "A band couldn't tell who. Shots fired. Folks are scared." Thomas felt the old tightening return. "Where are they now?" "Moved on," Walter said, but words spreading. "People are arming up." Nantan stepped beside Thomas, surveying the scene with a calm born of long vigilance. "This is the moment debts are tested," he said quietly. The woman looked between them, confusion written across her face. "Are they?" She hesitated, glancing at Nantan. "Are they coming back?" Thomas answered before Nantan could. "No one's coming back if we don't invite them." That night, Thomas called the neighbors together. They gathered under the open sky lanterns, casting warm circles against the dark. Faces lined with worry turned toward him, men who had once doubted him, women who had once passed his farm without a glance. "We don't know who fired those shots," Thomas said. "We don't know why. What we do know is that fear will make it worse." Caleb Morris was there too, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Easy for you to say," he muttered. Thomas met his gaze. "You were here. You saw what happened when we held our ground without firing." Murmurs rose. Some nodded. Others looked away. Nantan stepped forward, then his presence commanding silence. "We will not cross your land," he said. "We will not pursue your people. But if violence comes from fear, it will find fear waiting." The words were not a threat. They were a fact. Thomas raised his hand. "Here's what we do," he said. "We keep watch together. No patrols, no hunting parties, just eyes and ears. If trouble comes, we talk first. And if they don't, someone called. Then we remember who we are." Thomas replied. It was not a perfect plan. It was not even a strong one. But it was enough. The night passed without incident. So did the next. The rumors faded as quickly as they had risen, starved by the absence of reaction. People returned to their work, their routines, their small, stubborn hopes. Weeks later, Thomas found Lila waiting by the fence, watching the field sway. She smiled when she saw him. "My father says the debt is lighter now," she said. Thomas chuckled. "I didn't know it had weight." She tilted her head. "Everything does." He handed her a small loaf, fresh baked. She accepted it solemnly, then broke it in half and returned a piece to him. For a moment, they stood together, sharing bread and silence. As the sun dipped low, Thomas looked out across his land, across lines once drawn in fear, now softened by work and waiting. He understood then that the law of debt was not about owing. It was about remembering who stood with you when standing mattered most, and that he knew was a law worth keeping. The first sign came at dawn, subtle enough to be mistaken for weather. Thomas McGraw stood at the edge of his field watching the light slide across the leaves when a hush settled over the land. Birds lifted and went quiet. The wind paused as if listening. He felt it then, the same tightening he had known before the cavalry arrived, before the settlers rode in, with fear on their faces. Trouble did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it came as absence. By mid-morning, riders appeared to the east. They wore blue. Thomas did not count them. He did not need to. The formation was larger than before, tighter, more deliberate. This was not a visit. This was an answer. Captain Jonathan Hale rode at the head posture, straight eyes forward. He dismounted when he reached the fence and approached alone, boots crunching on gravel that had not been there yesterday. Thomas noticed how the land kept changing under pressure. "Hale," Thomas said. McGraw Hale replied. He did not offer a hand this time. They stood in the open, the distance between them measured and formal. Behind Hale, the cavalry began to spread out with practiced ease. Thomas felt the weight of it press against his ribs. "They've changed the orders," Hale said. Thomas nodded. "I figured they would." Hale's jaw tightened. "Command wants a decisive end to the uncertainty. They're tired of quiet that looks like weakness." "And what does decisive look like today?" Thomas asked. Hale glanced west. A forced relocation beyond the mesas. Now, before nightfall, Thomas felt the word force settle like grit in his mouth. "They're already moving west," he said. "You know that." "I know what the paper says," Hale replied. He tapped the folded orders at his side. "And it says, we move." A low rumble reached them, then Apache riders appearing on the horizon, fewer than before, their pace steady, their intent clear. They stopped well outside range, holding ground without challenge. Thomas looked from Hale to the riders and back again. "If you push now," he said, "you turn patience into defiance." Hale's eyes flickered. "If I don't, I lose command." The honesty startled Thomas. "Is that what this is about?" "It's about lines," Hale said. "And who draws them?" Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Lines drawn by fear don't hold. They crack. And when they do, they cut." Hale swallowed. For a moment, the man beneath the uniform showed through, tired, conflicted, carrying the weight of decisions made by people far from dust and heat. Then his shoulders squared again. "We ride in 1 hour," he said. "Clear your land." Thomas did not move. "I can't," he said. Hale stared at him. "This isn't a debate." "It is if you're still listening," Thomas replied. "Yesterday, you chose restraint." "And I was warned for it," Hale snapped. He caught himself lowering his voice. "They sent reinforcements to make sure I don't hesitate again." Thomas took a breath. He thought of the tokens on his table, of the neighbors who had begun to trust the quiet, of Lila's steady gaze, of seeds pushing roots into damp soil that might not survive another stampede of boots. "What if I go west?" Thomas said slowly, "and speak to Chief Nantan?" Hale shook his head. "You don't have authority." "I have access," Thomas said. "And time if you give me that hour." Hale hesitated, the order burning in his pocket. He looked back at his men, then west again. "If this goes wrong, I'll answer for it," Thomas said, "like before." The silence stretched thin. At last, Hale nodded once. 1 hour, he said. "After that, we move." Thomas did not waste a moment. He walked past the fence and across the open ground, hands visible, pace steady. The Apache riders watched him approach. Chief Nantan dismounted to meet him, eyes alert. "They come," Nantan said. "I know," Thomas replied. "They mean to make an example." Nantan studied the cavalry lines forming behind Thomas. "Then we must decide what example to be." Thomas felt the weight of that choice settle between them. "If you stand," he said, "they'll push. If you move, they'll claim victory." Nantan's gaze was calm. "We will not be driven like cattle." "Then don't be," Thomas said. "Let me stand where it hurts them most." Nantan frowned. "Between guns. Between certainty, Thomas corrected. They expect you to resist. They don't expect me to refuse to leave. Nantan considered. Lila rode forward, then her horse stepping lightly. She looked from her father to Thomas. If you stand, she said quietly, they will see you. That's the point, Thomas replied. Nantan closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. We will hold, he said, but we will not advance. Thomas turned back toward the cavalry, heart pounding. He walked to the center of the field and stopped planting his boots in the soil where green stalks swayed. He faced east alone. Hale rode forward, disbelief flickering across his face. McGraw, get back. Thomas shook his head. Not today. Hale raised his hand, signaling the line to halt. You're obstructing a lawful order. I'm obeying a human one, Thomas replied. Don't turn this land into a lesson written in blood. Hale looked past him to the Apache, then back to Thomas, and finally to the field alive, now fragile and real. The hour was nearly gone. A lieutenant approached Hale, whispering urgently. Hale listened, then lifted his gaze to the sky, where clouds gathered again thick and low. Thunder murmured closer than before. Hale clenched his fist. If I stand down, he said, I'm finished. Thomas met his eyes. If you don't, so is this place. The seconds ticked by, each one loud as a drumbeat. Hale raised his hand, then lowered it, then raised it again, uncertainty tearing at him. The cavalry waited, the Apache waited, the land waited, and Thomas McGraw stood where the lines crossed, knowing that the next command given or withheld would decide whether mercy could survive its final test. The thunder rolled closer, no longer a rumor, but a presence, low, deliberate, patient. It seemed to pace the seconds as Thomas McGraw stood in the field, the green stalks brushing his boots, the earth damp beneath him. He felt the land's quiet insistence, the way it pressed upward, as if to say, stand. Captain Jonathan Hale sat rigid in his saddle eyes, moving between Thomas and the Apache line beyond him. The cavalry waited in a disciplined stillness, horses blowing softly, leather creaking. The moment had narrowed to a single breath. McGraw-Hale said, his voice carrying, "This is your last warning." Thomas did not turn. He kept his gaze on the horizon where the hills rose and fell like a held breath. "Then hear my last answer," he said. "I'm not leaving." A murmur rippled through the ranks, irritation, disbelief, a flicker of something like respect. Hale's jaw tightened. He lifted his hand, then stopped, fingers splayed in indecision. From the west, Chief Nantan raised his hand, not in command, but in acknowledgement. The Apache riders held their line unbroken. Lila sat tall among them, eyes fixed on Thomas. She did not wave. She did not move. She trusted him to finish what he had begun. Hale rode forward until his horse's hooves pressed into the damp edge of the field. "You're asking me to defy orders," he said quietly, "to put my career, my men at risk." Thomas turned at last and met his gaze. "I'm asking you to choose what you'll carry the rest of your life," he said. "A paper with a seal, or a place that stayed whole because you let it." Hale swallowed. "You don't know what they'll do to me?" Thomas nodded. "I know what they'll do to this land if you don't." Thunder cracked sharp close, and rain began to fall in earnest fat drops, darkening uniforms and dust alike. The field breathed it in. The stalks bowed and rose again, resilient. A lieutenant rode up beside Hale, voice urgent. "Sir, visibility's dropping. We should move now." Hale closed his eyes for a heartbeat. When he opened them, they were clear. "Hold," he said. The word fell like a stone into water, heavy, decisive. Relief moved through the cavalry, not loud, but palpable. The lieutenant stared, stunned. Sir Hold Hale repeated louder this time. "No advance." He turned to Thomas. "You've made your point." Thomas shook his head. "You did." Hale drew a breath and raised his voice toward the west. "Chief Nantan," he called, "we will not pursue today." Nantan inclined his head, once rain tracing lines down his face. "Then today we'll remember you kindly." The Apache line began to withdraw, slow and deliberate, disappearing into the rain. Lila lingered just long enough to press her palm to her heart, then followed. Hale dismounted boots, sinking into the softened ground. He approached Thomas Rain, plastering his hair to his forehead. "This won't be the end of it," he said. "They'll review my command." "I know," Thomas replied. Hale laughed, once a short sound edged with relief. "You're a stubborn man." Thomas smiled faintly. "So I'm told." When the cavalry rode east, the rain followed them, blurring the line between departure and erasure. Thomas stood alone in the field until the last rider vanished. Only then did his knees weaken. He knelt and pressed his palm to the ground, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the mud. That evening, neighbors came not with rifles but with lanterns. They gathered at the fence, then crossed it, stepping carefully into the field as if entering a place newly made sacred. Walter Boone arrived with a loaf tucked under his arm, his eyes shining. "Thought you might need supper," he said. Thomas rose, mud-streaked and smiling. "Thought you might need to see it." They stood together, watching the rain taper to a whisper. Someone laughed, softly. Someone else wiped their eyes. No speeches were made. None were needed. Later, when the night settled and the land drank its fill, Thomas returned to his house and took out the carved strip of wood Chief Nanton had given him. He turned it in his hands, tracing the lines. A knock came at the door. Nanton stood outside, rain-darkened posture calm. "I came to say what must be said," the chief said. Thomas stepped aside. "You're welcome." They sat at the table, the candle's flame steady now. Nanton placed a bone token beside the carved strip. "The debt is answered," he said, "not because blood was spared, but because it was refused." Thomas exhaled. "I didn't know if it would work." Nanton met his gaze. "You did not look away. That is how it works." They rose together and stepped onto the porch. The stars were breaking through the clouds, clean and bright. The field glistened alive. "Trouble will come again," Nanton said. "I know," Thomas replied. "When it does," Nanton continued, "you will not stand alone." Thomas nodded. "Neither will you." Nanton mounted and rode west, his figure dissolving into the dark. Thomas stayed on the porch until the night cooled and the world settled into its quiet breathing. He thought of Sarah of water, shared of lines held when they mattered most. He had chosen. And in choosing, he had learned something the frontier rarely taught, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide. The morning after the rain felt different. Not gentler, this was still the frontier, but steadier, as if the land had decided to hold what had been given to it. Thomas McGraw woke before dawn and lay still listening. No hooves, no shouted orders, only the low hum of insects and the soft, persistent breathing of the field outside his window. He rose and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool clean. Droplets clung to the leaves, catching the first light. The seedlings stood taller than they had the day before, their color, deeper, more certain. Thomas felt a strange humility settle over him. He had stood against lines and orders, but this quiet persistence was something else entirely. By mid-morning, people began to arrive. They came not in a rush, not with alarm, but with the careful curiosity of those who sense a turning and want to see it with their own eyes. Walter Boone came first cane, tapping hat in hand. He stopped at the fence and took in the field. "Looks like you talked the land into listening," he said. Thomas smiled. "I think it decided on its own." More followed families from the North Trail, a pair of traders passing through a woman with flour to trade, and questions she wasn't ready to ask out loud. They stood at the edge of the field, respectful, as if crossing it required permission. Thomas didn't stop them. He simply walked ahead, boots sinking into damp earth, and they followed. It felt important that they feel it, the softness underfoot, the living give of ground that had once been brittle as bone. "They didn't come back," someone said. "No," Thomas replied. "They didn't. Will they?" Another asked. Thomas looked west, then east. "Not today." That was enough. At noon, a rider appeared from the east, alone and unarmed. Captain Jonathan Hale dismounted at the fence and waited. Thomas approached, wiping his hands on his trousers. "They've accepted it," Hale said without preamble. Accepted what Thomas asked. "That the sweep won't happen," Hale replied. "Command's calling it a reassignment of priorities." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's one way to put it." Hale exhaled. "They won't say your name in the report." "That's fine," Thomas said. "The land knows it." Hale looked out over the field, his expression unreadable. "I've been ordered east," he said. "Different post, desk work if you can believe it." Thomas chuckled softly. "Sounds safer." "Safer," Hale agreed, "but not better." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Hale extended his hand. Thomas shook it firm and steady. "You did a hard thing," Hale said. "You made it look simple." Thomas shook his head. "I just didn't move." Hale mounted and rode away, dust rising lightly behind him, already settling back to earth. Thomas watched until the rider disappeared, then turned back to the field where neighbors stood talking in low, hopeful tones. That afternoon, the Apache returned, not in force, not with urgency, but with purpose. Chief Nanton arrived with a small group, dismounted, and walked into the field without hesitation. He knelt, pressed his palm to the soil, and nodded. "The land accepted," he said. Lila stepped forward and crouched beside a seedling, careful not to touch it. "It's strong," she said. "It will be." Thomas replied. "If we let it." Nantan rose. "We will move farther west," he said. "But this place will be remembered." Thomas considered the word. "As what? As a place where guns did not speak," Nantan answered. The Apache stayed only a short while. Before leaving, Nantan placed a final token on Thomas's table, a simple stone, smooth and heavy. "To weigh words," he said, "so they are not spent lightly." As the riders disappeared into the hills, Thomas felt the last tension ease from his shoulders. Not vanish, nothing ever vanished on the frontier, but ease enough to breathe. Evening came slow and warm. Neighbors lingered, sharing food and quiet laughter, telling stories that did not end in blood. A child ran through the field and was gently called back, the seedling spared. Someone began to hum. The sound carried unbroken. When the stars came out, Thomas sat alone on the porch, the field breathing softly before him. He thought of Sarah, of the way she used to watch the sky change colors and say nothing, trusting that silence could hold meaning. He understood now what she had known then. The frontier did not need more noise. It needed places where restraint was remembered, where courage looked like stillness, where mercy was allowed to finish its work. Thomas McGraw did not know how long the peace would last. He did not pretend the world had changed because of one field, one choice. But he knew this today: the guns had not spoken, and because they had not, the land had. Autumn arrived without ceremony. One morning, Thomas McGraw woke to a coolness that lingered, a hush that felt earned. The field had changed again. The stalks were thicker now, their leaves broad and sure, the color deepening into a green that promised grain rather than hope alone. He walked the rows slowly, fingers brushing the plants as if greeting old friends. He did not count them. He did not need to. The land had answered in its own way. People came less often now, not because interest had faded, but because life had resumed. Wagons passed without stopping. Riders tipped their hats and continued on. The frontier, fickle as it was, had absorbed the story and moved forward, carrying it quietly, like a scar that no longer ached. One afternoon, Thomas found Walter Boone at the fence, staring out at the field. "Never thought I'd see this here," Walter said. "Not again." Thomas leaned beside him. "Me neither." Walter cleared his throat. "Folks are saying things. Folks always do." "They're saying you changed something," Walter said. Thomas shook his head. "The land did." Walter smiled faintly. "Maybe." But somebody had to stand still long enough for it to remember. That evening, as the sun sank low and the air turned amber, Apache riders appeared one last time. Not many, not urgent. Chief Nantan dismounted and approached, his steps unhurried. Lila followed, taller, now steadier, her gaze curious rather than guarded. "We came to close what was opened," Nantan said. Thomas nodded. "I was hoping you would." They walked together through the field. Nantan paused at the place where Thomas had stood, between lines where the ground still bore a subtle memory of boots and rain. He knelt and pressed his palm to the soil. "The debt is finished," he said. "What remains is choice." Lila looked up at Thomas. "My father says this place will be spoken of," she said. "Not as a border, as a pause." Thomas smiled. "I like that." Nantan rose. "We move west at first light," he said. "Farther than before. Where the hills are kinder." Thomas considered the horizon. "I hope they are." "They will be," Nantan replied, "because we will remember why we chose them." They returned to the porch. Nantan placed the smooth stone back into Thomas's hand. "Keep this," he said. "When words grow heavy." Thomas closed his fingers around it. "I will." When they mounted to leave, Lila lingered. She reached into her pouch and withdrew a small folded cloth. Inside was a single seed, dark, hard, unassuming. "For when you forget," she said. Thomas accepted it, touched by the simple weight of trust. "I won't." She smiled, a real smile this time, and followed her people into the gathering dusk. Winter came early. The harvest was modest, but it was enough. Thomas stored what he could, shared what he must, and learned to rest when the land slept. On cold nights, he sat by the fire and listened to the wind trace old paths around the house. Sometimes he spoke aloud to Sarah, to the field, to the quiet. He did not expect answers. He had learned that listening was often enough. In spring, rain returned gentle, steady. The field answered again. By summer's end, travelers spoke of the place without needing a name. That farm, they said, where the guns didn't fire. Some came to see it. Most simply passed by, a little slower, as if remembering something they could not quite place. Thomas grew older, as men do. His hands stiffened, his steps shortened, but when he walked the rows, the land seemed to meet him halfway. He planted when the season asked, it rested when it did not, and spoke when words could do more than silence. One evening, as the sky burned with color, Thomas stood at the fence and felt the familiar press of gratitude, quiet, durable. He thought of a bottle uncorked in the heat of a child's bowed head, of a line held when it mattered. He understood finally what the last drops had become. They were not water. They were witness, and witness once given did not evaporate. It settled into the soil. It took root. It fed a future that did not need to shout to be real. Thomas McGraw rested his hands on the fence and watched the field breathe. He did not know how long peace would last. He did not ask it to be forever. He only asked it to be honest, and on that land where mercy had been allowed to finish its work, it was. In a world that teaches us to survive by looking away, this story reminds us that the smallest act of compassion can carry the greatest weight. Thomas McGraw did not change the frontier with strength, status, or weapons. He changed it by refusing to let fear decide his actions. He stood still when moving would have been easier, and in doing so, he gave others the chance to choose restraint over violence. Life often places us at quiet crossroads, moments where no one is watching, where kindness feels costly, and where walking away seems safer. But those moments are where legacy is formed, not in grand gestures, but in simple decisions made with courage and empathy. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment stood out to you most and why? Please share your reflections in the comments below. And if stories of resilience, compassion, and the human spirit speak to you, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey. Your presence here matters more than you know.